Well, I had to bring water up with me this morning because I'm still recovering from Thanksgiving. We had all of our kids home, and along with the kids came the grandkids, 3 of them. Along with the kids and the grandkids came the dogs. We had a total of 3 of those in the house as well. Along with the kids, the grandkids, and the 3 dogs came the grandkid with the cold, who stayed for 2 more days, who then went home and left me with the cold for the rest of the week. And so I spent Thursday, Friday in bed just enjoying the afterglow of Thanksgiving. And pretty good today, but still a little dry in the throat. One of the things we discovered having everybody home this weekend and having 3 little boys in the house and having 3 dogs in the house is that God designed dogs for little kids. And when our kids were growing up, we had big dogs. We had a golden retriever. We had a chocolate lab. Now we have kind of a wannabe dog. It's a chihuahua, and which is pitiful in so many ways. But I always noticed when our kids were little that, and they were in the high chairs, that when you let the big dog in the house, the dog would immediately go to the high chair and have a seat. Because big dogs know that all good things come from high chairs. And children love to bless dogs as well. And so it's just it's a match made in heaven. And it struck me as I was working through the passage we're going to look at this week that apparently this symbiotic relationship between little kids and dogs at the table has been going on for at least 2,000 years. And we're going to look at that shortly. By way of quick review, the series we're in right now, I'm calling it A Walkabout with the King. And it is a look, a study through the Gospel of Mark. And the reason I call it a walkabout with the King is that one of the characteristics of Mark's accounting of Christ's life is there's lots of movement. Jesus is always moving from one point to another. That's almost what defines the beginning and end of each story that Mark tells, is that Jesus is on the move. And we're going to see that again shortly. As we've seen up to this point, Jesus has drawn a lot of attention as he's been going around. He's been teaching, and he's also done miracles. We've seen some amazing miracles. We saw the feeding of the 5,000, where he fed all those people with just 5 loaves and 2 fish, and yet at the same time, he rebuked his disciples because he said they had hard hearts. It wasn't that they were against what he was doing, it was just that their perspective of what it meant was so limited. They didn't get the big picture of what was going on. And we've also seen that he drew some critical attention from the religious elites, the people that you would have expected to be his peer group. As he was a great teacher, you would have thought that the other notable teachers and religious figures would have found a kinship with him, but that's hardly the case. In fact, what we've seen is that they were out to discredit him. Last week, we looked at the criticism that Jesus' followers ran into because they had not done the proper ceremonial washing of their hands before they ate their meal. And the Pharisees landed on that and tried to discredit Jesus for what his disciples had failed to do, which in their eyes was very defiling behavior. And yet Jesus' response to them was a harsh rebuke. And instead of agreeing with them that there had been this oversight, instead he rebukes them for their own hypocrisy. Because he said that they had taken their traditions and it actually made them more important than the righteous intent of God's laws. And that they, in fact, had used their traditions to circumvent what God really wanted. And he uses an illustration of ways that they had found to avoid caring for their parents, as the 10 Commandments had commanded to honor their father and their mother. They had found a religious loophole to let them get around it. And Jesus said that what it demonstrated was that the real problem, the thing that really defiles people, is not things from the outside like dirty hands. The real problem we have is what comes up out of our own hearts. It's our own greed, it's our own pride, it's our own lust that is the real problem that needs to be dealt with. That's what breaks our fellowship with God. Well, that brings us up to where we're at today, and that is in Mark chapter 7, starting at verse 24. And again, we see Jesus on the move. From there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And he entered a house and did not want anyone to know. We've seen this before, haven't we? Jesus looking for some solitude, some time alone to get away from the press and the demands of the crowd. And now what Jesus does is he ventures outside of the region he's been in, the region of Galilee, which was predominantly Jewish, and he goes into this area of Tyre and Sidon, an area that was predominantly non-Jewish, Gentile. And perhaps the thinking is that if he were to get away from all of the Jewish people who were so interested and tuned in the way he was doing, perhaps it'd be easier there to find a little bit of quiet. It says he even went to a private home, again, trying to escape the spotlight. The region of Tyre, probably a good place to escape the fans from Galilee. We know from the Jewish historian Josephus, he said that for the Galileans, the people of Tyre were one of their most bitter enemies. The Jewish thought of Tyre and Sidon as being synonymous with greed and arrogance. And this goes all the way back into the Old Testament. If you go back to the prophet Ezekiel, here's part of Ezekiel's prophecy. It says, "Your heart," speaking to Tyre, "was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I," the Lord speaking, "cast you to the ground." So all the way back in Ezekiel, there was this prophecy of judgment against Tyre because of their pride. And that opinion of Tyre had continued right up to the present. But Tyre had also long been a financial powerhouse. In fact, 500 years prior to Jesus visiting that region, here's what Zechariah had to say about the same place. He said, "Tyre has built herself a rampart and heaped up silver like dust and fine gold like the mud of the streets." How's that for a description of tremendous wealth? He said, "You are so wealthy, silver is like dust laying around. And gold is like mud in the streets." You have that kind of wealth and prosperity. Tyre itself, the city, was on an island. Although if you were to look at Tyre today, it doesn't appear to be an island. It's connected to the mainland. But that's because about 300 BC, they had a little run-in with Alexander. And Alexander felt that Tyre was getting a little too pretentious, trying to be a breakaway. And so he came against them, and it was hard to lay siege because they were an island just offshore. But Alexander had an ingenious way of dealing with that. There was a city, I think it's Ushu, on the mainland directly opposite Tyre. And what Alexander did was he demolished the city, and then he used the rubble of the city to build a causeway out to the city of Tyre, the island. Over the years, that causeway has silted in, and now it looks like it's all part of the land. Originally, Tyre was an island. But Alexander used that causeway then to lay siege to the city of Tyre for about 7 months, ultimately battered down the walls, and as a result, he either killed or sold into slavery the 30,000 inhabitants of the city. But that wasn't the end of Tyre. Around 64 BC, the Romans rebuilt the city, and it flourished again. In fact, if you were to tour that part of the world, you can still see the ruins, the Roman ruins of Tyre today. And so in Jesus' day, Tyre was a rebuilt and a flourishing city once again. Galilee itself did lots of trade with Tyre. And yet Galilee was poor and Tyre was rich. And Galilee resented those lopsided economics. It was a love-hate relationship. While they loved the trade that they were able to do, they hated the fact that they were the underdogs and Tyre was the financial powerhouse. We find Jesus going into the region of this very metropolitan, wealthy area. It doesn't say he went to Tyre itself, but he went into the region of Tyre. And again, a place where probably the crowds from Galilee would not follow him. Well, when he gets there, we find out that the best laid plans can run amok. He could not be hidden. Once again, Jesus tries to get away, and people start showing up. there were people in Tyre that already knew about Jesus. In fact, if you went back to Mark chapter 3, verse 7, it talks about a great crowd who followed him from Galilee, Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, from beyond the Jordan, and from around Tyre and Sidon. In fact, quite possibly the home that he went to stay at was someone who had been part of this crowd, who had gotten to know Jesus and had opened their home to him. But other people knew about him as well, and one of those was a particular woman that Mark focuses on. Mark chapter 7, verse 25 and 26. Immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. Jesus has dealt with this sort of thing before, hasn't he? A concerned parent who comes to him, who has a child that is afflicted in some way. In this case, the affliction is an evil spirit. And we've seen Jesus deal with other people who had some sort of occult involvement, who were afflicted by evil spirits. But there's something unique this time, because Jesus is not in his home territory anymore. He's not back in Galilee, where all of his ministries happened up to this point. This isn't a Jewish majority area. And most significantly, the woman coming to him herself is not Jewish. In fact, Mark is very specific with his description about this woman. First off, she was a woman. He says she was a Gentile, and specifically, she was a Syrophoenician by birth. Now, last time we looked at the uproar that ensued when the Pharisees caught Jesus' disciples eating with unwashed hands, because to them that was a great religious offense. But compared to what's about to happen here, that was a drop in the bucket. For one thing, Jesus, as a Jewish rabbi, is engaging with a Gentile, which in their day and their culture, an Orthodox Jew would wash his hands when he returned from the marketplace in case he had had contact with Gentiles, to remove the impurity. In fact, an Orthodox Pharisee would not eat in the home of a Gentile so that he would not contaminate himself through that kind of contact. And yet here is Jesus engaging with a Gentile. In fact, he's engaging with a Gentile woman. Again, this was a very patriarchal culture. In the Jewish way of thinking, men were definitely a class above women, Jewish women, and Gentiles were below that. So if you're a Gentile man, you're already a third-class citizen in their view, which means that if you're a Gentile woman, you're probably a fourth-class citizen on the social pecking order. Not only is Jesus engaging with a Gentile woman, but he's engaging with a Gentile woman who was born and raised in the Phoenician Republic of Tyre. She was born there. She's a Gentile through and through. And in fact, she lives among a people group that were considered enemies to the people of Galilee. In the social religious circles that Jesus would have been expected to honor, this woman is someone to be avoided at all costs. And yet, nevertheless, Jesus allows this woman to engage him in conversation. And her request is very simple. Please deliver my little girl. And so Mark sets us up with an unclean woman begging for help to rid her child of an unclean spirit. Jesus' response. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." What is he talking about? Well, from the perspective culturally of a Jewish teacher, she would have understood that the children, the ones who had the right to be at the table, would be the children of Israel. They were the ones that the Jews believed had a special place at God's table. And that he, as a rabbi who was teaching, who was feeding the people, that that was where his focus was. Those were the ones that he was to feed and care for. And it was also a known fact that the Jews commonly referred to Gentiles as dogs. It was a racist, derogatory term. And so Jesus here takes that term and really he's using it about her. Saying, why should I do something good for you? Why should I give you the treat? Why should I meet your request since my priority is to feed the children at the table, not the dogs? Given the cultural influences in play, at one level, Jesus' answer is what you would expect. I don't think his disciples were the least bit surprised that Jesus seemed to be rebuffing this woman's request. They were probably ready to help move her out of the house themselves because they just felt this was an inappropriate contact for this woman to be coming to Jesus. But on the other hand, the things we've seen from Jesus up to this point make this seem rather shocking. Jesus never seemed to give in too much to cultural convention. He was willing to stand up to the religious leaders of his day when they challenged his disciples about unwashed hands, and he was willing to call them hypocrites to their face. And so how to make sense of this suddenly seeming to cave in and buy the party line when it comes to this woman? Has Jesus really just called a desperate mother a dog? Dogs were rarely kept as pets in Jewish homes, and that's understandable. If you've had dogs, you understand that if one of your great life goals is to maintain cleanliness and purity in the home, a large dog may not be your best choice. In fact, dogs have this rather disturbing habit of rolling in things that they find. I think in the dog world, this is like a canine selfie. It's a way to say to other dogs, look where I've been, look what I found, check this out right here. And other dogs are fascinated by this. I mean, they'll all gather around and say, oh, wow, if only I could have found that. Where were you at when you came across this amazing treasure? I had a secretary one time that told me she had 2 large dogs and they'd been out running in the woods and they found where somebody had shot and cleaned a deer. And they just immersed themselves in what they found and then came home and wanted to share with her the good things that they had discovered. That's dogs. And yet Jesus didn't just call her any dog. He used a term that denoted a small house dog. So maybe that was nice of him. They didn't call her a big slobbering dog, but he called her a little house dog. Don Richardson, the missionary author, years ago wrote the book called Peace Child. I heard him speak on this passage one time, and he suggested that behind this statement that Jesus made, there was some nonverbal communication that was going on. He thinks that what happened was as Jesus said this statement, and he uses this terminology that at one level the woman expected to be called a dog, and yet he twists and he uses an endearing term for a little dog. Don says the other thing is that as she looked in his eyes, she saw them twinkle. She realized that he was pulling her chain a little bit. He was inviting her to challenge what everybody expected him to say. And so she does. Mark 7:28. She answered him, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Great comeback. It tells me that dogs have been waiting by high chairs for at least 2,000 years. She takes Jesus' metaphor and she spins it right back at him. She refuses to believe that the kingdom of God is an either-or proposition. Either the children get fed or we get fed, but we can't both be fed. In fact, it actually got me thinking this week. You know, one of the problems the disciples had was they tended to look at the things Jesus was doing from up too close. They didn't back up to see the bigger picture. When Jesus fed the multitudes there on the hillside, they didn't even think about the prophecy of Ezekiel, how it was God who would be the shepherd of his sheep, who would feed them on the hillsides. They didn't put the pieces together to say this miracle is talking about something bigger than just lunch. And it struck me that maybe there's something even bigger for us to see, because Mark puts that miracle right before he tells this story. And do you remember what happens at the end of that miracle? Everyone's fed. All of Israel is fed that is sitting there on that hillside. And then what happens? 12 baskets of leftovers are picked up. What does this woman say? Well, yes, Lord. You may feed the children first, but even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the table. I think Mark wants us to see that God's intent always was that there'd be more than enough. It was not just for Israel. There was enough to go around. And this woman sees it, and she lays claim to it. Theologically speaking, Israel, from the time of Abraham, was given a special role in God's plans. Genesis chapter 12, we have what is called the Abrahamic covenant, where God came to Abraham and made him a promise that he was going to make out of Abraham a great nation, Abraham being the father of the nation of Israel. Here's what he says. I, the Lord speaking, will bless those who bless you, Abraham, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Abraham's descendants were right to see that God had put them in a place of primacy. Where they went wrong was they believed that that gave them a claim of exclusivity. Does that make sense? They'd been given a role of primacy in what God was going to do, but that didn't mean that it was exclusively for them. God had always said, through you, all the nations will be blessed. That message continues on. Isaiah in the Old Testament, 42, verse 6. I, the Lord, will make you, Israel, as a light for the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. The Apostle Paul picks this up in his letter to the Romans. He says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. I think this is kind of hard for us as Americans to wrap our heads around, because we are children of the melting pot. Our identity is rooted more in geography because of the land we live in, and political persuasion, being part of a democracy, than it is in our cultural ancestry. But really, we're the ones who are out of sync with most of history and other world cultures. Most people identify most strongly with their racial group, their family group. And Israel had a strong identification of who they were, and God, in fact, used one particular family to tell a part of his story, to prepare the way for what he was doing. He took Abraham's children and he filled their history with the witness of his power. He inspired their literature and gave a rich library of revelation. He preserved and worked out through that particular family tree to set the stage for his son to come into the world. And had those people, had that family as a whole, embraced and understood fully what God was doing through them, and been willing to not try and hold it for themselves, but to see that they were to be a mouthpiece, a way to spread what God was doing to others, they could have been the greatest missionary force the world has ever seen. Because God's intent, forever and always, was to show grace to all. You know, it's interesting because when you look at this conversation between Jesus and the woman, it would appear that Jesus loses the debate. He throws up an objection to this woman. He says, is it right to take the children's bread and give it to the dogs? And she comes right back and says, well, even the dogs get the crumbs that fall from the table. Win. I think that's the first and maybe only time, I think it is the only time in the New Testament that you see Jesus lose a debate. If you go back to when he's 12 years old, we have the account of Jesus going to the temple, his parents taking him there, and they lose track of him. And when they find him, instead of him being over at Vacation Bible School or doing arts and crafts or whatever, he is sitting in the middle of all of the teachers. And it says this, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them, asking them questions, and all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his answers. Okay, that's at age 12. We find later he's up against some Sadducees, highly educated, skillful arguers themselves. They've tried to trick him and stump him with their questions. And finally they say, teacher, you've spoken well, for they no longer dared to ask him any question. Jesus was brilliant, and he certainly never lost a theological argument. And people backed away from even getting into them eventually. And so why is it that he loses with this woman? I mean, was he just off his game? Did he underestimate a girl? And what happened here? You ever watch a chess master at work? I've heard that chess masters are always thinking 10 to 15 moves ahead of their opponent. And sometimes in playing chess, part of the strategy is to give up certain pieces because it's part of a bigger strategy to win, to get to where you want to go. I think Jesus knew 10 moves out where this debate was going. And he set it up, and he wanted her to win because his plan was grace. He said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed, and the demon was gone. What was it that Jesus found so compelling in this woman's reply? Why did he want her to win the debate? Have you ever seen a washing machine running on a spin cycle when it's out of balance? It begins to shake, vibrate, makes all kinds of horrible noises. If you want to do something fun this afternoon when you get home, go online, go to Google, and put in washing machine spin cycle brick, and then see what YouTube videos show up. There's one of them that is just phenomenal. It's about 8 minutes long, and this machine literally tears itself apart. I mean, to the point that the drum, the tub of the machine, has actually broken free of the chassis and is rolling around the yard until it finally rips its power cord out. You know, it's a good image for how we live life sometimes. We get ourselves imbalanced. We get ourselves centered on all the wrong things. I got thinking back to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5, verse 3. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." I think what Jesus means there is that the poor in spirit recognize their need, and they're willing to come to God and to recenter themselves in him and to say, "Lord, you are the one that I need more than anything else." The Pharisees had centered themselves on religious rituals. Some people center their lives on wealth or accomplishment or beauty or athletic prowess. Or when they can't make those things work, they focus and center themselves on other things, ways to escape, whether it's through alcohol or drugs or pursuing whatever hobby it is they have, but they lead lives that become uncentered and imbalanced. Pride will uncenter you. Pride is believing that it's all about me. And when you try and make that the center of your life, it's going to be unbalanced. And you see people tear themselves apart, tear their families apart, like that machine that's unbalanced on the spin cycle, because the wrong thing is at the center. And I think that Jesus tested this woman to find out what she was going to center on. You know, she would have been very justified in most of our minds if she had bristled at Jesus' comment. How dare you even intimate that I'm a dog? If you think the Galileans didn't think much of the people of Tyre, I guarantee the people of Tyre didn't think much of the people from Galilee. You hicks, poverty-stricken, you arrogant little religious elites that think that somehow you're better than everybody else. You wash your hands because you think you touched me. You won't come in my house just because of where I was born. And now here comes this man, Jesus, and he actually brings that up. She would have had every right at one level to say, who do you think you are? I don't need you. I can live my life just fine without you. There's got to be another solution that does not require me to stand here and take that from you. And yet when she looked at life, when she looked into Jesus' eyes, when she knew what she knew about who he was and what he had done, she said, I'm willing to be in second place. I'm willing to be recentered and for the center not to be on me. And if it even means that you would call me something less than first class, although I see the twinkle in your eye, I'm even willing to be under the table as long as I can be at your table, because you're the one that I need. And I don't need to be number one. I don't need to be in the center. I don't need to win. But I do need you. And Jesus responds to that kind of faith. The commentator Mark Strauss says that for Mark's readers, the woman becomes a model disciple who is willing to be last instead of first, and who discerns the inclusive nature of the gospel message. I agree with John Richardson that she saw the twinkle in Jesus' eye. The Pharisees were put off looking at hands that they considered defiled. The disciples got misdirected because they focused just on the bread that those hands provided. But I think this woman who sought Jesus' hand, who needed his help, she looked into his eyes. She saw the twinkle. She recognized compassion, and she dared to take the challenge because she saw his heart, and she was willing to be recentered. This is an invitation from Jesus to unlikely people. It's an invitation to people who didn't grow up in good Christian homes. It's an invitation to people who have rolled in stuff that doesn't smell very pretty, who have saturated themselves in things that good people would look down on and wouldn't want to touch. And yet for people who would love to have Jesus touch them. It's an invitation to imbalanced people. And even when we've decided to follow Jesus, it's easy to get unbalanced, isn't it? Easy to begin to center our life on things that can't really meet our deepest need. And sometimes it's our pride that stands in the way. We don't want to admit that we have centered ourselves on the wrong thing. We don't want to admit that the thing that we have made most important is the thing that will become ultimately our undoing. Letting Jesus recenter us takes humility. Because Jesus won't let you come on your own terms. We come on his terms. And yet when we do, we find that he has the freedom, he has the riches, he has the satisfaction that we so desperately need. So how do we get there? I think we have to take stock of ourselves, and then we just have to ask. It's Lord Jesus, I need you. Come into my life. Recenter my life in you. Take control. I don't care where I sit at the table. I don't care if I have to sit under the table. But Lord, please, let me be at your table. And if you look him in the eyes, wherever you are, a follower that's gotten uncentered, someone who's never taken the step to ask him into your life before, if you look in his eyes, you will see love, you will see grace, you will find freedom, and as Don said, you will see twinkle, twinkle. Amen?